Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming back to the auditorium. And if you're watching on a screen somewhere, thank you very much for watching. Today's topic is medieval majesty, which for Europe is really about Christian architecture, which is a bit of a pet subject for me, because I used to work for the Anglican Diocese of Chichester, which is the body that sort of administers the Church of England in part of the south of England. So quite a lot of clergyman jokes came across my desk. Some of them I can't repeat, but some of them I can. I'm sure we've got some ex-clergymen or ministers amongst us, so I mean absolutely no offence at all. But I remember one story of a new barber shop, a new hairdresser's shop that was opened in a particular city. And there's a notice outside saying, walk in off the street. So somebody walked in off the street, had a haircut and normal conversation, what do you do? And the chap said, well, I'm a fireman. And the chap said, and the barber said, you do so much for the local community, I insist that you have this haircut for free. So he said, well, thank you very much, had his haircut. The next morning, of course, there was a nice bottle of wine, a nice thank you card saying, thank you very much. The second day, another person walks off the street, what do you do? Well, I'm a policeman. A policeman, you do so much for the local community, I insist that you have this haircut for free. So the next day, a nice box of chocolates and a thank you card and so forth. And that day, another person walks off the street. What do you do? Well, I'm a clergyman. A clergyman, you do so much for the local community, I insist that you have this haircut for free. So the next morning, outside the shop, there's a whole line of clergymen. So as well as going around the Aegean Sea, we're also taking this historical journey from left to right on the timeline. If you'd like a copy of the timeline, we've got some of these nice ones out on the bar at the back, and they look like that, and they're printed on a nice card, and the great advantage is that it's blank on the back, so you can use the card to write a nice list or something when you're fed up with the timeline. But there are plenty of them on the bar at the back if you'd like one after the lecture. Architecture can be divided into these main headings, but as I said on a previous occasion, you're sure to start an argument if you try and make it as simple as this. But really what we're doing is the sort of central section, Byzantine, Romanesque and Gothic today, about 1,000 years of history. Don't forget to look at the backs of your Euro notes, if you're carrying some Euro notes, because there you'll find the major styles of architecture represented. The classical, which we've just seen, this is the Romanesque style, there's the Gothic style, and then on the 50 and 100 you get the Renaissance styles, or Renaissance styles, Palladian and Baroque, or Baroque. These are my names for these styles, but as I said yesterday, you're in danger of starting an argument if you're too rigid about the different names, because different people call different periods different things. So we're going to start from the classical foundations, which we laid over the last couple of times that I've been with you. And as any builder will tell you, laying the foundations is very important. And then we'll move into the medieval period, Byzantine or Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic. And nobody quite knows why Gothic is called Gothic. There wasn't some race of Goths who introduced this style of architecture, so nobody's quite sure why it's called Gothic. But anything with a pointed arch has come to be known as Gothic architecture. So this is really the story of the spread of Christianity across Europe, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. So where did we leave off when we were looking at classical architecture? Well, we left off with the 5 orders of classical architecture. Do you remember the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian that had come from ancient Greece? And then the Romans added the Tuscan and the composite order. So we have these 5 orders of classical architecture. We have the use of materials introduced during the Roman period, the brickwork in particular, and the discovery of the arch. This is the Arch of Hadrian in Athens that many of you might have seen when we were in Athens, and you can't help thinking that someone is demonstrating that an arch can span a wider void than just posts and lintels can. So the Roman period bequeathed us the widespread use of the arch, also the vault, the earthquake-proof vault, of course, and also the dome on tops of circular buildings. Just as a reminder, we're looking at the Pantheon here, a building which is very nearly 1900 years old. So on these classical styles hang the medieval period, which begin really with the long-lasting Byzantine or Byzantine style. How did it come about? Well, I'm no historian. Fortunately, we got a resident historian on this voyage, so if I make great howlers with the dates, he'll no doubt correct me afterwards. You remember those howlers that used to be circulated of school children? What was it? Captain Cook circumcised the world with a 150-foot clipper. It's that kind of howler that I'm likely to make in the next few minutes, so I'll try not to. But basically, the Roman Empire had become so large that it was unwieldy and almost impossible to govern. Lots of people have tried governing Europe. It's very, very difficult, I can assure you. And the Romans tried it, and it was partially successful, but an emperor called Diocletian, there are his dates, is famous for a number of things. I'm just going to pick out 4 things he's famous for. First of all, the Diocletian baths in Rome, which is this sort of first century aquatic pavilion in Rome. Secondly, the Diocletian window. Now that's not really, he didn't give it that name, but this particular shape, the arch shape with the 2 vertical columns, has become known as the Diocletian window. It's probably called that because there are so many of them on the Diocletian baths. But that has become a sort of motif that you find all over Europe and indeed the world. So here we are in Ålesund in Norway, and there you see a Diocletian window put back after the entire city was destroyed by fire in 1904. And here we are in Venice in Italy, the Zitelli monastery, and lots of people thought that this church facade was probably a Palladio facade. Palladio was a famous Italian architect, and because his signature was this, so my little red pointer has stopped working, but you can see there, his signature was that sort of Diocletian window, so people thought that that was a Palladio facade. People aren't sure at the moment whether he had any hand in designing that particular one, but we simply don't know. Another thing Diocletian was renowned for was his enormous retirement home on the Adriatic coast in a place that we now call Split. In those days, it was part of the Roman Empire. It's been through lots of different changes of control. It's now part of Croatia. And there, the old town of Split, see if I can make my pointer work. I can't. I'll try another one, which is this one. Right. Can you see my little pointer there? So the whole of this portion of the old city of Split is Diocletian's old palace. And there's a floor plan. It is absolutely huge. There in the center, well, not quite the center, but in this quarter here, you can see what is now Split's cathedral, which is a tiny cathedral, but it was originally built as the mausoleum of Diocletian. When the Christians came along, they didn't like to remember Diocletian too much because he wasn't that good about Christianity. So they took over his mausoleum, got rid of his sarcophagus, and that's now become Split's cathedral. Because it was a Roman mausoleum, it had rather inappropriate pictures of naked Roman soldiers going around the top, which when it became a cathedral, they didn't think this was entirely appropriate imagery for worshippers when they looked up. So these Roman soldiers have all been, dismembered would probably be the right word. And, but it's well worth a visit, the Diocletian mausoleum in the middle of Split. There's a 4th century drone picture of what the palace would have looked like on the waterfront in Split in modern-day Croatia. And you can visit it. There is a picture I took on the north side, the north entrance to Diocletian's palace in Split. But there's one other thing that Diocletian is kind of renowned for, and that is deciding that the best way to govern the empire would be to split it in two, into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. And so two new capitals were declared, Milan in the west and Nicomedia, modern-day Izmit, in the east. And these were the two capitals of the East and West Empire. Now, the next on the scene, I told you I was no historian, the next relevant person on the scene is the Emperor Constantine. There are his dates, and in 313 he said Christianity is good, and in 323, 10 years later, he said this is going to be the official religion right the way across the Roman Empire. But the other thing that he is renowned for is he decided the empire should be reunited once again, and it should be governed from the new capital there in what he called Constantinopolis, Constantine's city, which was the former Roman city of Byzantium. It's modern-day Istanbul. So it was Byzantium, then it became Constantinople for a long time, and now it's called Istanbul. And then, of course, he's famous for the great triumphal arch there in Rome. That's Constantine's arch in Rome. And so with Constantine is born the long Byzantine or Byzantine era, which combined this Roman power and engineering, Greek taste and philosophy, and this newfound Christian faith and spirituality. And suddenly, across the Roman Empire, there was a need to build churches, because up and then, Christians had been meeting in private houses, but now that it was an official religion, large churches needed to be built. But the question is, what shape? And from Roman days, they knew how to do circular meeting places. And you might remember when we were talking about Roman architecture, we talked about the invention of the basilica shape. And for several hundred years, these basic shapes were the staple shapes for Christian churches. But as you know, Roman history goes through all sorts of crises, and the Western Empire collapses. More dates, you don't have to remember them all. We've got a resident historian here, so he can refresh your memory on dates if you need it refreshed. But the Emperor Justinian, there are his dates. No, he's not. I think his dates are on the last slide. But he's a 6th century emperor. He reunites the empire once again and is very keen to reassert imperial power. And so he sets about building a bigger and better church than anything that has gone before. Definitely a building to impress. And so this Church of the Holy Wisdom, or Santa Sophia in Latin, or Hagia Sophia in Greek, is a huge church in Istanbul, constructed during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. And the result, this massive church, its interior is awesomely huge. You can ignore the Arabic discs. That's it became a mosque. It's a mosque again now today, actually. But it's a huge place of worship. Originally built as a church, then it became a mosque, and then it became a museum with no religion at all. And now I believe it's a mosque again. And the engineering genius of this Byzantine era was placing a hemispherical dome over a square space, because the floor plan of this church is essentially square. But if you first construct enormous arches over the sides, and then you fill in the four corners with curvy triangles, which are called pendentives, it literally means hanging pieces, you can then put a dome, or as architects later discovered, a drum and a dome on the resulting circle. So this incredible engineering feat of putting a circular dome on a square space using huge arches and pendentives becomes a hallmark of Byzantine architecture. And the Church of the Holy Wisdom in Constantinople is crowned with this massive dome, which at 100 feet in diameter is still not as big as the Pantheon Dome in Rome, which we were talking about last time. But the space covered is awesomely huge. And the reason for that is that although it's a square floor plan and the dome is only 100 foot, if you put half a dome at each end, a semi-dome, then the area you feel is being covered is a good 200 feet in one direction and well over 100 feet in the other direction. And it had exactly the desired effect. People went into this edifice in those days, just as they do today. They looked at the amount of space that had been covered, and they said, wow. And from this great exemplar, many great domed buildings can be found across the Roman Empire from this sort of period. Here we're looking at a picture of San Vitale in Ravenna. And here we're looking at a picture of the interior of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, a 9th century basilica, but hugely modified since then. There's a picture of its exterior. I'm sure a number of you have been there, but it's just worth noting that pointed ogive shape above the central door there, because that'll crop up again and again as we go through different periods of architecture. The other reason this is a particularly interesting edifice is that it's one of the first cruciform-shaped churches. Now, what I mean by cruciform is cross-shaped. There you can see that it's basically a basilica, but transepts have been put on either side, and it's now a cross-shaped edifice. There's also a difference that's worth noting between Western churches and Eastern churches. After the Great Schism, as the Eastern churches went off in different directions, the habit was to put the domes on the corners, rather than north, south, east, and west, like we see in St. Mark's. The domes are on the corners. So you can usually tell what period a domed church comes from as to by looking at the positioning of the domes. If it's north, south, east, and west like that, it's probably pre-millennial. It's a distinctively Byzantine-looking building, a dome sitting on huge arches. And this basic concept, a round dome atop a square building, is very common throughout medieval church design. Here we're looking at the 11th century monastery at Daphne, not far from Athens. Some of you might have been there when we were parked in Athens. About 10 years ago, I was fortunate enough to go to Ethiopia, and there, which is an Orthodox Christian country, there in Addis Ababa, they're constructing, the cities are expanding very quickly, so they're constructing churches, and they are huge domed churches on basically a square floor plan. This is an aerial view of Westminster Cathedral, Westminster Roman Catholic Cathedral in London, opened in 1903. There's a renowned English poet called John Betjeman. He was a 20th century poet. He made wonderful remarks about various things, and what he said about this building, he said it's a masterpiece in striped brick and stone in an intricate pattern of bonding, the domes being all brick, in order to prove that the good craftsman has no need of steel or concrete. So that's Westminster Roman Catholic Cathedral in London. And this technique of putting a round dome on a square building transcends all religious divides. Here we are in a mosque in Istanbul. Here we are in the synagogue in Florence. It's basically a dome sitting on pendentives. And this is what, for 500 years, grand places of worship looked like. And the Byzantine era really lasted until the 1400s, when Constantinople fell to Sultan Mehmed. But as the first millennium passed, there you can see the first millennium roughly in the middle of the timeline, a couple of things happened. First of all, there was a great split between the East and the West churches on theological grounds. And so the Eastern Church tended to carry on along this orange line, this Byzantine line, whereas the Western Church went its own way. But also, it being 1,000 years since Christ's first coming, a lot of people thought that he might be coming back, so better look busy. So there was a great outpouring of abbey and church building in the early part of the 1000s, the 11th century. Here we are in the church of San Miniato, just above Florence in Italy. This is an 11th century building. This is before William the Conqueror had come across to England. But look at the quality of the decoration already. But it is a distinctly Roman-looking building, isn't it? It's basilica-shaped. It's got these columns with fine Corinthian order capitals on top. And at the eastern end, it has this apse. The apse is the semicircular bit that's on the end of a basilica. And there you can see the light is admitted through very thin stone or alabaster, which was the old way of admitting light into buildings before glass became a mainstream commodity. Still in Tuscany, this is the extraordinary collection of edifices in Pisa, showing off Romanesque at its most florid. The baptistry in the front there, the Duomo or cathedral in the middle, and the famous Leaning Tower in the background. Incidentally, do you know what Big Ben in London said to the Leaning Tower of Pisa? He said, "I've got the time if you've got the inclination." No. I've got worse ones than that. What we're beginning to see is subtle changes in the tops of columns. Do you see distinctive face-like figures beginning to appear? Up until this stage, column capitals were entirely abstract. But as the Romanesque period develops, you see more and more stories being told in the tops of columns. But it's still essentially a classical type of architecture. Here we are in the baptistry in Pisa. There you can see columns, Corinthian capitals, both columns and pilasters, the square columns that were introduced by the Romans. Here is a Romanesque facade in Lucca. Lucca is the city in Italy where, I'll think of his name in a minute, help me. Who? The famous opera composer, Puccini. He either lived there or died there or was born there. I can't remember where. I think he lived and died there. But anyway, this is Lucca in Italy, and a fabulous decoration on a Romanesque facade. And this round arched basilica style of church building quickly spread across the whole of Europe. Here we are in France, the Basilica of Saint-Étienne Vignery, and this is the renowned abbey in Vézelay. And what you see at the far end is the beginning of the use of glass to admit light into the more important parts of the building. Here is the Basilica of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, fine Romanesque edifice. And the other thing that you see in cathedrals and abbeys like this is Saint-Sernin in Toulouse still, but you see it wherever there's a place of pilgrimage, is you see lots of little chapels built around the cathedral, because lots of visitors, lots of tourists would essentially go to these places, and they needed little meeting places. So around pilgrimage cathedrals, you find lots and lots of little chapels for the pilgrims to meet. Now, every British school child is taught the date 1066, which is when William of Normandy becomes King of England It's the death of King Harold, documented in the Bayeux tapestry, which adorns the stairwells of this ship. And you might have been on Michael's tour of the Bayeux tapestry. It's not the real one. It's a reproduction of the famous Bayeux tapestry that goes up and down the stairwells of this ship. Following William the Conqueror's arrival in the south of England, there immediately followed a massive building spree across the country of abbey and cathedral churches in a style that we often call Norman. We call it Norman because it was Norsemen who came across when William the Conqueror invaded. Norsemen, of course, were originally the people from Scandinavia, the Vikings. So it was the Vikings who brought the Norman style into the British Isles. But it went all over Europe. Here we are in Stavanger in Norway. There is a fine medieval cathedral which is in the center of Stavanger there in Norway. Note how the column capitals still showing little signs of classical inheritance. You can see the volutes there, but they are changing. Back in Winchester in England, some distinctive motifs to look out for of this period. Look out for that arch, the sort of large arch with two smaller arches inside it. I wish I could get my point. Oh, it is working again. Look, there we are. The arch with the two smaller arches inside it, that's a distinctive Romanesque motif. This cushion capital, the upside-down capital, which converts a circular column shaft to a square abacus, that's worth looking out for. Another thing worth looking out for is the carved patterns on the circular arches. Here we are at Southwell in England. Southwell? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's probably pronounced Southwell. The other thing that you don't see that often in England, but you'll see it all over Europe, is these twin pyramid spires. Almost wherever you go in Germany or France or Switzerland or Austria, you'll see these twin spires at the western end of an abbey or cathedral. You don't see it that often in England, but it is a Romanesque motif. And the other thing to look out for is these interlaced arches. Do you see how they've interlaced the different arches to create that extraordinary decorative effect? So as I was saying, Romanesque abbeys, cathedrals and churches are springing up all over the British Isles. This is the cathedral in Oxford in England. And just down the river from Oxford, if you find yourself there, do go and visit Iffley Parish Church. It's usually open. It's a lovely little Romanesque, tiny Romanesque parish church. And there is a photograph of it. And I think there's a picture of my wife just coming out of the door there. And but it is the most heavenly little church, and well worth a visit if you find yourself in or around Oxford. This is not far from where I live, a place called, it's spelt Staining, but it's pronounced Stenning, and it has this beautiful Romanesque church in its center. But perhaps the greatest Romanesque cathedral in all of Europe, and I would say this because I'm a Brit, is Durham Cathedral. Excuse me, is Durham Cathedral. Some European is getting his own back on me for suggesting that Durham is the greatest Romanesque cathedral. But I think it is. And there is this fine interior of Durham Cathedral. And here is the north porch. And do you see once again that ogive shape has appeared above the doorway there? And that there is the renowned knocker. The legend is that once you've knocked on that knocker, you are granted sanctuary inside the church. So if lots of bad people are chasing you, and quite a lot of bad people would chase you at different times in English history, then if you can knock on that knocker, you're safe once you've knocked. So we shall see whether that's true or not. I've not tried it, but it might work. Here's a picture I took round on the other side of Durham Cathedral. Do you see this checkerboard pattern here? I was fascinated. I have a friend who was the UNESCO World Heritage Manager for the Durham site, and his previous job had been at the Great Mosque in Cordoba, and before that he was in charge of the pyramids in Egypt. He was Muslim by birth, and he is saying this checkerboard pattern is an Islamic pattern that was brought across to England, presumably by the Masons who'd been traveling a bit and thought that pattern looks nice. We'll bring it back and put it into our palette of things that we can offer the various people who commissioned great abbeys and cathedral churches. So we've passed through the center of the new millennium, through the Byzantine and Romanesque period, which is the Romanesque period is the first truly pan-European language of Christian architecture. But now something rather interesting happens, and we're going to watch a short video which describes what happens. So here goes.
The building of a cathedral tested the skills and ingenuity of the cathedral builders to the limit, yet the ideas and methods that they used had barely changed since Roman times.
In fact, the style they built in the early period is called Romanesque. It's based on the kind of arch that the Romans used, the round arch. The shape was always based on a circle, often a full semicircle, sometimes a section of one, or with the curve slightly distorted. It was simple, but limited.
Arches in the style known as Romanesque can be sturdy, even chunky. A whole building made of these arches has a muscular, powerful effect. But in the middle of the 12th century came an idea that would change all this, a revolution in design and construction that would raise cathedral building to new levels of sophistication.
It was a style that would become known as Gothic. It was born in France at Saint-Denis, near Paris. Here, the visionary Abbot Suger rebuilt part of the Abbey Church, burial place of the French kings. He was using a new kind of arch, not a round arch, but a pointed one. But his aims went beyond this.
For Abbot Suger had a vision. He wasn't simply after something bigger and grander. He had a theological rationale for his new design. It was a theology of light.
For medieval thinkers, light had a profoundly religious meaning. The embodiment of spirit, one writer called it.
The work should brighten our minds so they travel through the light to the true light of Christ. In seeing this light, the dull mind is resurrected from darkness.
Abbot Suger and his unnamed master mason had glimpsed the possibilities of the pointed arch. It's both stronger and more flexible than a round one. Both the shape and width of a pointed arch can be varied in more ways. And the weight of a building naturally moves downwards and outwards in a shallow curve closer to that of a pointed than a round arch. This simple difference was to change the entire way cathedrals were conceived, designed, and built. The second Sunday in June 1144 may have had a greater effect on architecture than any other day in history. At the dedication service, bishops from all over Europe gathered at Saint-Denis to witness a building designed to evoke the experience of heaven more completely than anything before it.
The bishops were awestruck. They had seen the future.
So we saw in the video some of the rationale for moving to pointed arches, which have become the standard shape, haven't they, for places of worship in the Western world. This is a photograph of a church in Reykjavik, in Iceland. There you can see pointed arches. This is a 20th century cathedral in England, in Guildford, and there again, pointed arches. This is a 20th century cathedral in the USA, the Washington National Cathedral, again, pointed arches. So why have pointed arches become the kind of signature for places of worship? Well, I've got 4 different theories, and they may all be wrong, so you might have an even better theory than all 4 of these. First of all, there was so much trading and invading and crusading going on that the pointed arch motif, which was widespread in the Middle East, came back across Europe. In Armenia, in particular, pointed architecture was very well developed. My second theory is that there was a Romanesque fondness for this interlacing, and if you interlace semicircles, you get this pointed arch shape. So that could be another reason. A third theory, now this is an engineering theory, so as our guide said today, I need your attention. If you look at a crossing square, basically two columns in each direction, the longest arch is this one, isn't it? The one going right the way across here, the sort of hypotenuse going across the triangle. Now, if that is going to be round, then the ones at each end need to be either slightly lower, or if they're going to be the same height, they need to be pointed. If they were lower, you get an undulating roof, which they didn't want. So the ones at either end are slightly pointed. So that's my third theory. And the fourth theory, which is another engineering theory, which you heard mentioned in the video, is that pointed arches can bear much heavier loads on much more slender columns than round arches can. So whichever theory you choose, and as I say, they could all be wrong, pointed arches become the new mode. And this rather heavy Romanesque round arch style gives way to this pointy arched Gothic style. This impressively solid style, as you said in the video, gives way to a style that seems to draw the eye up and up and up. Here are some examples from England. This is the Waltham Abbey in Essex, near London in England. And this is the west end of Gloucester Cathedral. And the other thing they discovered from this era is that it's possible for the forces to be carried down through quite narrow struts. So essentially you can set up a relatively sort of skeletal structure using narrow struts with lots of space. And because glass was becoming more and more widely available, lots more light could be admitted. So the concept of the flying buttress, which carries the force down to the ground that way, became another hallmark of this particular period of architecture. And you see flying buttresses on many, many different Gothic buildings throughout the world. Here we are in Bath, in England. Some people say Bath, I say Bath. Here we are in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And here we are at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. And sometimes the flying buttress is actually incorporated into the masonry. There's an example from Gloucester Cathedral. And sometimes the flying buttress is actually incorporated into the internal masonry. There's an example from Worcester Cathedral. But not every tall Gothic cathedral was a success first time. The Bishop of Beauvais in France visited Paris, came back and told the masons, well, I want something even taller than they got in Paris. So he commissioned this enormously tall cathedral. The problem was it kept on falling down. And the result, Beauvais Cathedral, which is the tallest medieval Gothic vault in the world, kept on falling down, and in the end, only the east end of it was built. So if you go to Beauvais in France, what you'll find is this magnificent Gothic east end, but there's nothing down at the west end. In fact, if you go to the west end, what you find is the old Romanesque abbey that was there before, and there you can just see towering behind it is this great new modern cathedral. Well, it was modern in those days, but it was never actually completed. Every country's masons had their own ways of making Gothic cathedrals splendid. Here we are in Florence, in Italy, where there's lots of coloured marble available. Here's the North European take. We're in Wismar, which is now in Germany, where brick was used to make very high vaults. And this is in Lübeck in Germany, the highest brick Gothic vault in the world. And when Gothic came across the Channel into Britain, there are three distinct phases that were documented. The first is called the Early English phase, and Salisbury Cathedral is a very good example of that. It's distinguished often by these lancet-shaped windows. So that's the first phase. And this is a photograph taken by a friend of mine of the interior of Salisbury Cathedral, and the photograph is not upside down. There's this wonderful font in the center of the cathedral, and the water in the font, the surface, is completely mirror-like. So if you point your camera onto the surface of the water, there you can take a picture, an upside-down picture of the roof of the cathedral. The second phase of Gothic architecture that came across into the British Isles was the decorated phase, and Lincoln Cathedral would be a fine example of that, and so would Lichfield Cathedral, which was heavily restored in the 19th century. And then the third phase was called the perpendicular phase. The perpendicular phase is distinguished because in the tracery, you often get vertical lines that go all the way from the bottom to the top. Now, this was a Romanesque abbey, but a chap called William of Wykeham came along at the end of the 1300s and said, no, that's all out of date, I'm going to modernize it. So he modernized it into this 14th century perpendicular style, and that west window was blown out during the English Civil War. There was a big civil war in England in the 1600s, and the window was blown out, and all the citizens gathered up the glass and hid it, and then when all the soldiers had gone away, they brought the glass back and they tried to put it back, but they failed. So that window is like modern art. It's sort of completely random pieces of coloured glass from the inside. Have any of you seen the film of Les Miserables, or Les Mis as we sometimes call it? In that film, the abbey scenes are filmed in the cloister of Winchester College, and an architectural purist like me can say, well, I can know that's not France, because what I can see here is perpendicular architecture. And perpendicular never made it back across to the continent of Europe. It stayed in Britain for some reason. So that's another thing to look out for. If you find yourself in Britain, perpendicular architecture is a curiously British thing. It never went back to continental Europe. Back to France, here we are in Amiens, the facade of the great cathedral in Amiens. And these cathedral facades were like encyclopedias. They're educational. As you walk in, you can see lots and lots of biblical stories being enacted around you. Here's a slightly more a close-up of the same facade. If you look carefully there, trying to get my pointer to work, there's Christ sitting in judgment. Here's the souls going off into the jaws of a very nasty-looking dragon on one side, and other souls going into the bosom of Abraham on the other side. And everything is in this facade. Labours of the month, everything is there. Saints, prophets, the lot. So once you've been through that facade a few hundred times, you'll probably know the entire Bible, even if you can't read or write. And not many people in those days could read or write. So having pictorial storytelling facades like that was terribly, terribly important. So we've almost come to the end. Just a summary on Gothic. It was a complete break with the classical tradition. It was a genre invented or discovered to depict the distinctly Christian understanding of God and the Church. And Gothic was heavily revived in the 19th century by the Victorians, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we come to my final talk. So we've covered about 1,000 years of history. Just a reminder that if you'd like a copy of this timeline, there are some on the bar out at the back, and I'll be there as well in a minute or two to answer any questions that you might have. And I'm going to leave you with a picture of a masterpiece of Italian Gothic. It's the Upper Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, begun in 1228. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe I'll see you again, but in the meantime, thank you very much for being here.